Well, good evening and welcome everyone. Noswaith dda a chroeso I chi gyd. Thanks very much for joining us this evening. I'm Professor Colin Reardon, Vice-Chancellor of Cardiff University. You're all very welcome, especially our Cardiff members and other supporters. Tonight's digital showcase will be recorded, as you've just heard there. We'll send you the recording link after the event, which you can share, and of course you can review and go back over what you've heard this evening. I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting things you'll want to review. So this evening we're going to showcase research in our neuroscience and mental health programme. As you know, I'm sure, a person's mental health and well-being are influenced by a wide range of environmental factors, but also genetic risk factors. The charity Mind, which many of you will be familiar with, estimates that 1 in 4 people will experience a mental health problem of some kind each year. And NHS figures estimate that around 34 billion is spent on mental health each year, and that poor mental health carries an economic cost to the UK of 105 billion a year. So these are enormous numbers. And of course, it goes well beyond the cost. It's all about the quality of life implications for people, and the implications of poor mental health, such as a delayed diagnosis or insufficient support in effective treatments. They can all have a significant detrimental effect, of course, not only on the individuals themselves, but also on their families. And this is why understanding how our minds work and what we can do to help resolve some of these issues is a key area that we're interested in researching and do research at Cardiff University. And we've put significant investment in a research pipeline to translate our findings into real-world applications rapidly and effectively, because if we do the research and if we find out what is going on, we really want to move that rapidly into treatments if we possibly can. So I'm delighted that this evening you'll hear more about this research. It's going to be presented by colleagues based at the university's Centre for Neuropsychiatric Genetics and Genomics, the CNGG. The Centre Director is Professor James Walters. A senior lecturer, Dr Antonio Pardiñas, is joining us as well, as is Dr Kim Kendall, who is a research fellow and a specialist registrar in psychiatry. And they're going to share with us how a better understanding of how the brain works at a genetic level can help provide the foundations for new and future management and treatments. So during the event, we'll be hearing from James, Kim and Antonio shortly. And after that, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers. I hope we'll have about 20 minutes or so for that. We will finish at 6 o'clock promptly, but I hope there'll be plenty of opportunities there. We have received some questions in advance, so we'll be starting with them. But as we proceed, if you have any questions you'd like to ask, and please feel free to do so and put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer as many as we have time for during the session. But if there are more than we have time for, we will get back to you afterwards. So feel free to put your questions, and they will all be answered either in the session or subsequently by email if we have more than we can get through. So that's all I had to say by way of introduction. So now I'm very pleased to ask James to start us off, and then Antonio will come on, and followed by Kim. So welcome, James.
Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor, and to the team for inviting us to speak tonight. It's our absolute pleasure to be here. So I'll begin by sharing my screen. Thank you. So we work at the Hayden Ellis building depicted here. As has been said, I'm James Walters. I'm the director of the Centre for Neuropsychiatric Genetics, and we're going to talk to you this evening about our work and why we think it's such an exciting time for our field, and how we think we're going to help impact and better the lives of those with mental illnesses. Just to set the scene, really, I think it's worth emphasising the importance and impact of the problems that we face. And this is particularly depicted in severe mental illness, which we've got an interest in. And by that, I refer to schizophrenia, broader psychosis, bipolar disorder, and severe depression. And so these conditions typically come on in late adolescence and in early adulthood. So at really crucial times in people's lives, in both establishing their professional, social, and family lives. And their impact is all the worse for having an onset at that time. I think as well as affecting people's mental health, there are effects on people's physical health, and we mustn't forget that. Just one of the demonstrations of the impact these conditions can have is that functional outcome is generally poor for people suffering with the conditions. And in our samples, which I think is reflected in clinical services, over 80% of people are unable to hold down a job. Having said that, people do get better, and I think that's an important message to emphasize. In treating people, we as psychiatrists take a biopsychosocial approach, so biological elements being very important, and we'll concentrate principally on that today, but also psychological and social elements being key to helping people recover. I think overall, one of the stark demonstrations of the impact of these conditions is the fact that people with severe mental illnesses have an average and reduced life expectancy of between 15 and 25 years. This is worse than chronic conditions like diabetes, most cancers, cardiovascular disease. And we can say that people at the onset of illness are looking at that as a prognosis. So I think it demonstrates the importance of us doing better, if you like. And the other thing to emphasize is that we have good treatments. Antipsychotic treatments for schizophrenia, for instance, work in the majority of people. There's a proportion of people whose symptoms don't respond, but for very many people, those treatments come with really significant adverse effects. And we're going to be hearing about different elements of that today. Okay, the other thing is, what about genetics? Where does genetics come into this? Well, I think for the last 30 or 40 years, we've known that these conditions run in families. So if you have a sibling or a child with schizophrenia, then your chances of developing the condition are increased. And beyond family risk, if you look in twins, then monozygotic twins have more of a risk than dizygotic or non-identical twins. And this indicates a potential genetic contribution. And indeed, that's been confirmed in subsequent family-based studies. And so we know that a substantial part of risk for these conditions is down to genetics. But it's not genetics in a simple, if you carry a variant, you're going to develop the condition. It's more complex than that. And equally, we know that genetics isn't the whole story. So we know that non-genetic risk factors, particularly social risk factors, are important as well. The other thing to emphasize is that the field in the last 10 and 15 years, and this has been led really by the centre in the university, internationally under the previous leadership of Professor Sir Michael Owen, has led these advances in molecular genetics, which have really given us more knowledge about the conditions in the last 10 years than we have had for the previous 100 years. And so the university, as the Vice-Chancellor outlined, has really supported this research, and I think we want to acknowledge that. The reason we've gained these insights is through that support over the last 15 or so years. And we were the first centre in Wales to receive Medical Research Council centre status, and have now transitioned to the Cardiff University Centre for Neuropsychiatric Genetics and Genomics, which will be formally launching with the Vice-Chancellor's kind support in March next year. And we'd really welcome people to engage with that relaunch. What we're doing in the centre is principally finding genes. That genomic discovery is a really key part of it. And as is depicted here, what we hope to do with that is then use those findings to improve on existing diagnoses, which we know are useful but imperfect. And by doing that, better targeting treatments and developing new treatments. And we're doing that in tandem with the National Centre for Mental Health, our NHS-facing arm, as well as the Wolfson Centre for Youth Mental Health. And then as well, using those genes to find what the underlying mechanisms are and the impacts on brain function. And that is supported by the university's investment in the Neuroscience and Mental Health University Innovation Institute, which is key in developing that expertise, as well as other entities within the university. And then the crucial third arm is using those genes to find new drug targets and better drug targets. And the investment in the Medicines Discovery Institute is really going to transform our work in that area. The other elements that we're going to hear about specifically this evening are using genes to improve the treatment that patients receive. And so Antonio Pardiñas is going to be talking about pharmacogenomics, which is the descriptor of that field. And then we're going to hear from Kim Kendall, who's going to describe how we've translated some of our research findings into the clinical coalface and hopefully demonstrate the benefits to patients and their families that can have. So I'll now hand over to Antonio.
Thank you, James. Diolch. I'm Antonio Pardiñas. I am a biologist by training and a geneticist by specialization, and I am part of the large group of basic researchers that work at the CNGG. And our mission during much of the last decade has been to quite literally paint the human genome, highlighting the fractions of it, the regions of it that contain genes or genetic variants, mutations that confer risk of developing schizophrenia. And you can see here precisely how that picture looks like at the moment after our latest work, which was published earlier this year. We have more than 250 genomic regions that we have managed to highlight, containing over 1,000 genes. And while going into each of these genes could require in and of itself an army of biologists like me, something that comes out of work like this is the realization, the very interesting realization that each of us, and when I say each of us, I mean each person in Wales, in the UK, in the world, carries mutations that confer risk of developing schizophrenia. The majority of us carry an amount of mutations that confer us an intermediate genomic risk. A few of us might carry a lot of mutations conferring a high risk, and a few of us might carry very few mutations conferring a very low risk. And because these mutations are so common, we actually call them common genetic variants. Our work in this area has highlighted that if you want to say a count of these mutations is a mild predictor of whether a person will, over the course of their lifetime, develop schizophrenia. As James has said, there are other predictors of a non-genetic, non-biological nature, which at the moment seem far more important. But because this is the case, interestingly, when we look at individuals who have already developed the disorder, individuals who have already been diagnosed with schizophrenia, we find exactly the same picture. The majority of individuals have an intermediate genomic risk. A few individuals have a very high genomic risk. A few individuals have a very low genomic risk. And what does this mean? Our work in looking at these samples of individuals with schizophrenia have highlighted that there might be some small differences in the symptomatology of these two extreme groups, the high-risk group and the low-risk group. And whether we can actually use those differences in symptomatology to do something clinically is a question that is very, very close to our core aim and our core mission, which is to actually improve the journey of everyone who at any point of their life develops some symptoms of schizophrenia or any other mental health disorder, and improve their journey through the mental health care system, which you have depicted here. And this is a very common depiction of not only this journey, but many other journeys. It's a leaky pipeline, which starts with a very high number of individuals and reaches to the end with only a very small number, because the majority of people get lost through these cracks here. And why is the case? Because some of these steps from going from symptoms to contact with health services to a diagnosis to a treatment are not really adequate for everyone. And if genetics can actually bring something to the table, it's actually making the care of everyone more fair. And there are points where we think the research that we're doing at the CNGG can actually contribute in the near future. And there you have, for example, where I have hinted that large-scale genomic studies could help us to improve the diagnosis of individuals. And there, the work that we do on pharmacogenomics could help with the journey of individuals throughout antipsychotic treatment. And within antipsychotic treatment, we're fairly interested in a particular drug called clozapine, which is the only evidence-based treatment for people who do not respond to a first-line antipsychotic or a second-line antipsychotic. And we have a very large amount of samples of individuals that have been treated with clozapine. They have schizophrenia called treatment-resistant schizophrenia, and this formed a study called CLOS UK. We have published a lot on data from the CLOS UK study, but I'm only going to highlight two pieces of our research. One, which looks at the genomic risk that individuals in CLOS UK have, and look at those individuals at high genomic risk, and also look at the individuals doses of clozapine and the individuals in CLOS UK that are taking very high doses of this antipsychotic. Now, the prescription of high doses of antipsychotic is not something that is trivially done. High doses of antipsychotics are only reserved for individuals who do not respond to lower doses. And of course, there is a process there that can take a long time to escalate these doses properly. What we find in this study, for example, is that individuals that have a high genomic risk for schizophrenia have nearly twice the chance of ending up in a high dose of antipsychotic, making this the first predictor that we're aware of actually those that could help us dose people in a different way, because there are not many or not any reliable predictors of antipsychotic doses, at least reflected by clinical guidelines. And this needs, of course, more research, but it has already been replicated by colleagues in Norway. In a similar topic, looking also at doses of this antipsychotic, we've also looked at genetic variants that do not have anything to do with the risk of developing schizophrenia, but have something to do with what your body, the human body, does to the drug, to clozapine, how the body metabolizes clozapine. And we've seen that taking account of genetic variants that modify the metabolism of clozapine also has effects on how people get to the doses they need to respond to the antipsychotic. And taking account of these variants early on the treatment journey of a person might be also relevant to actually making them respond to treatment earlier, or enabling them to respond to treatment earlier. So as a basic researcher, I have to concede that the application of these insights to the actual clinical pathway that I've shown is very likely not in my hands. It will be in the hands of clinicians, as highlighted here by these two non-copyrighted plumbers that are here fixing this leaky pipeline. And considering that clinicians have a lot to say on the practical application of these insights, I'm going to cede the stage to my colleague, Kim.
Thank you, Antonio. Okay, so as has been said, my name's Kim and I'm a psychiatrist. So I work in rare variation, and today I'd like to talk to you about copy number variants. Copy number variants, or CNVs, are the deletion or duplication of large sections of DNA. So you all probably know that DNA is made up of single letters. We're talking about extra or less material of about 1,000 of those letters. And the first CNVs to be implicated in the risk of schizophrenia were a deletion on chromosome 22. That was implicated in the late 1990s. And that increases your risk of schizophrenia greatly in comparison to a background population risk of about 1%. So 1 in 4 people with this CNV will develop the illness. The next one was actually discovered in Cardiff by Professor George Kirov, And that's the exons, so parts of the gene neurexin, which are deleted, can increase your risk of schizophrenia by 9 times. So this is really work that was pioneered in Cardiff. And since then, we have many more CNVs, which we know increase the risk of schizophrenia. However, what we also have found is that they are decidedly non-specific. So the same CNVs which increase your risk of schizophrenia will also increase your risk of other neurodevelopmental disorders, such as intellectual disability, autism, and ADHD. Some of my work, which I did in my thesis in recent years, extended this past the neurodevelopmental spectrum to show that individuals who carry these CNVs have an increased risk of depression. And those individuals who have actually not developed a neurodevelopmental disorder will nonetheless have decreased cognitive functioning compared to those without the CNV. Importantly for translation is work that again has been done in Cardiff, which has shown that these CNVs increase the risk of a range of physical health problems. Now these range from the everyday kind of things like high blood pressure and obesity, but also to the more severe. So for instance, I've taken a number of CNVs which are considered schizophrenia CNVs, and I've shown you some of their physical effects. So I'm sure you can appreciate that for individuals who carry them, whilst the CNVs are rare, they're very important for that person. Now I'd like to move on to how we started translating this work to the clinic. So in around about 2020, we set up the All Wales Psychiatric Genomics Service. And the reason we were able to do this is that we have medical geneticists, psychiatrists, and researchers, all within close proximity of each other who work really well together. And this service has been set up between the All Wales Medical Genomics Service, the National Centre for Mental Health, and with us at the MRC Centre. We're underpinned by a monthly multidisciplinary team meeting, which is staffed by a variety of clinical and non-clinical specialties. And we have a consultant geneticist, Annie, 2 psychiatrists, James and I, and a genetic counsellor called Donna Duffin. And really the work we do in this clinic is, we do it in 2 directions. We will see individuals with established genetic risk factors, and we can counsel them on their risk of mental health problems. But also in the other direction, we take referrals from the NHS. So if for instance, someone has a family history of psychiatric problems or something else which might suggest they have a genetic risk factor, we will see them and we'll take them through all of the genetic counselling they need. And if they feel it's appropriate, and we do, then they'll have genetic testing. And to date, well, include this slide is now out of date by 1 day because we've seen several more patients today. We've seen, I think it's 13 patients now across 1 to 3 appointments. And we've taken them through the range of genetic counselling, and where they've wanted it, we've carried out genetic testing, revealing these CNVs, which I've listed on the right. And I think the important thing here is to say that these are not just neurodevelopmental disorders. People we've seen in clinic have presentations from across the psychiatric spectrum. So I guess the one thing that clinicians often ask me is, well, how is this helpful for patients? In terms of now, then we are able to counsel them on risk of conditions in their family members. We are able to provide some input in terms of tailoring their physical healthcare. So for example, there's a CNV on chromosome 16, which confers a risk of cardiac problems. So we're able to say that they require echo, so a scan of their heart and follow-up from a cardiologist. But I think the most important thing that's come out to us, and something we didn't expect in the beginning, is that patients value the opportunity to understand their story better. And you know, these CNVs are not enough on their own to cause an illness, but they're part of the picture. And that's what people enjoy exploring, and they gain benefit from it. So we've had a really positive response so far. In the future, hopefully with more work, it might be possible to be able to start suggesting the appropriate medications that might work for an individual. Given the importance of people to us and the importance of stories, I thought I'd end on a story. So Mr. Jones is a 63-year-old gentleman, clearly in an anonymized story, and he has a history of anxiety and depression. He came to our clinic and he said that he'd always felt different, and this had actually resulted in being quite excluded by members of his family. he's got multiple physical health problems which are being treated by specialists across the various hospitals in South East Wales. And none of them were aware of the other specialists working on the same patient. And we were able to take him through his history, go through all of the genetic counselling and to test him and to show that there was one underlying variant which explained an awful lot of his physical health problems. So we were able to speak to all of the specialists and explain this to them. But the important thing is that Mr. Jones, once he received this explanation, found it so helpful. And it explained to him then, why is he so different? Why has he got so many physical health problems? And I really think that focusing on these stories really brings home the importance to patients of the work we're doing here. I'm going to end here and I'll pass you back to James.
Thank you very much, both Antonio and Kim. I hope we've conveyed what is an exciting time. So from investment in these areas in the university 10, 15 years ago to some clinical translation, which I think is really important now, but also offers many promises and fruits that we can exploit to develop better treatments and improve the lives of those with severe mental illness, as we've outlined. Really happy now to hand back to the Vice-Chancellor and take any questions. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much indeed, all three of you. It's really fascinating stuff. Some of it's complicated, but I don't think you need to be an expert at all to get the point of what you're doing there, particularly that you've developed this fundamental research really already into a clinical service, the All-Wales Psychiatric Genomics Service. So it's great to hear that's a reality now, and that it's actually more applicable than perhaps you had originally anticipated, being able to take in conditions right across the spectrum and offer genetic counselling, tailored healthcare in certain cases, which is great. So we do have some questions have come in, which is really good. Thank you. Keep them coming. We'll start off with one or two that arrived before the session. So there's one for Kim, which is I think a really interesting question. Why is, and it actually addresses something you've just been talking about, why is there a continued division between mental and physical health when they're indisputably intertwined, as you've just said, in fact?
Yes, so they are very much intertwined. So it's not okay that there is still a division. I would say things are getting better. Certainly within psychiatric services, we are trying to target physical health problems in our patients. We're well aware that our medications cause physical health problems. So we run wellbeing clinics, and certainly our junior members of staff do an awful lot of physical health. And we're really trying our best to build bridges with general practitioners and specialists in the hospital, just to try and make sure that division is less of a problem.
Okay, thanks. But as I say, it's really helpful to see that you are actually looking at those things together. There's one, I think, which would be helpful for Antonio to pick up, and that is how do we use the knowledge gained through genomic research to improve our understanding of the underlying pathobiology?
Yeah, thank you. It is definitely a very interesting question, and it's a very relevant one. And I think one of the things to clarify here is that mental health conditions are not conditions in which the features that we see, the clinical features, the symptoms, map neatly to alterations in genes. Everyone can probably think of conditions in which a biochemical marker is disturbed, and that can be very neatly traced back to a single gene that has something to do with that biochemical marker. That's not the case in mental health. So we need to actually be able to find the genes, and there is a large pool of suspect genes. Half of the human genome is somehow implicated in the brain. And if we accept that mental health conditions have biologically something to do with the brain, then that will be an enormous pool of genes, and we wouldn't even know where to start. So the genomic studies that we carry allow us to restrict that search to genes in which we find those genetic variants in the population of individuals with mental health disorders. And the idea is that now we've established hundreds of genes that have likely something to do biologically with schizophrenia. If we keep going forward, we will be able to establish genes that have something to do with specific symptoms of schizophrenia. And from then on, the relevance of new treatments and everything that I said that is true for current treatments, pharmacological treatments to schizophrenia, it could be potentially true for a novel treatment to schizophrenia. And for that, we need to establish the genes that are tied to specific symptoms, because otherwise there is no way from the clinical picture to actually even suggest which those genes might be.
And I think just to add to that, I think part of the ecosystem that there exists in Cardiff around neuroscience and mental health enables us then to take those genes and look at the potential mechanisms that they're identifying using cellular models and other model systems, as is happening in the University Innovation Institute, but also then get targets and work with the Medicines Discovery Institute in that respect. So I think that we're unique in being able to do all those elements, I think, which is, you know, down to, as we've said, the support, but also the insight that people coming way before us have had.
Okay, thanks. That's it's really, I mean, it's complicated. It's really interesting. James, a couple for you here, I think. One of them is whether there are family markers for bipolar illness and related psychosis.
Yeah, so as we tried to demonstrate, and bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, the genetic architecture, as we call it, the way genetics contributes to risk are very similar across the two conditions. And it's a combination of common variants that we all carry, as Antonio was saying, and also rare variants that are individually rare, but collectively apply to a significant proportion of patients, up to 5 to 10% of patients, depending on the condition. And risk is imparted by a combination of those typically. We're not at the stage yet where for an individual family, we can say that these markers will determine if somebody gets a condition. And I don't know if we'll ever get there, but what we think we may be able to do in time is use the combination of those to predict who may get conditions within families, but also what treatments they might respond to. So we're not there yet, but a part of the motivation for the work that we're doing is to move that forward. And you know, as we've said already, as well as genetic risk, there are other risk factors within families that are important. I think stress that as one of the questions.
It's taking all these factors together, and it will improve the accuracy of predicting the likelihood and the propensity.
Exactly.
So somebody's written in to say, do you need more volunteers? I have bipolar and I'm willing to join or volunteer.
Absolutely. We, you know, very, very keen. All of this research relies upon people giving up their time to participate in research, and we need hundreds of thousands of people to do that. So, you know, we coordinate this research across the world, which has brought together literally hundreds of thousands of people. And because of, you know, the complexities that we're dealing with, then we need those numbers. So please do, if people are interested. Probably the easiest route is through our National Centre for Mental Health website, and there's participant pages on that website. But if not, I'm sure we can coordinate with Bathog and others to be able to approach people who might want to take part.
And thank you to everyone who's taken part so far.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Thanks. So next question from the Q&A, from the live Q&A. Are the ethical risks of mapping individual genomes heightened in the area of mental health and well-being? So there's always an issue there, isn't it? If people find out something that might be rather worrying or... Yeah,
I mean, so there are definitely major ethical considerations in all the research we do. And, you know, the governance around setting up research studies has become all the more robust because of that, I think. And, you know, we work with patients and those with lived experience to inform our research all the time. And I think that's a really key element of beginning to think about those ethical complexities. But I think there are specific concerns within mental health and well-being because of the stigma that still surrounds those conditions, to be honest. And so it is something that is emotive and that people are conscious of. And so there are particular responsibilities that come to us in that respect. You know, we're doing research into genomics, and the results that we get aren't clinically accredited results. But part of the work that Kim has been leading on, and was one of the motivations for us setting up the clinic, was actually return of research results to people with the clinical genomics service. And that has really taught us, it's more about patient stories, but it's really taught us some of the complexities of this, and working alongside people from social sciences in Cardiff and bioethicists, I think, has been crucial in that, and will continue to be. So we were talking earlier today with ethicists in this respect, and I think it's a really key part of the work that we do.
Oh, that's really interesting that interdisciplinary work is beneficial, and there's lots of support in the chat there, or the Q&A in a way, for patient stories and taking that really into account. There is a question around early intervention with children, but it may be better to answer that one, I think, by email afterwards, because it's quite long and complex, but we will get an answer to that. So, but I'll come on to another one with about your pipeline there, with so many, you know, which has so many cracks in it, as we've seen. Is there real hope that we can make headway in the treatment of schizophrenia? I mean, we've been trying for decades now, haven't we? Where do you target the research, and is there resource to tackle it all? Big question.
It's definitely a big question. I think it's fair. I think it's probably fair to say that if we actually don't try to prioritize some aspects of the disorder, there's probably no resources to tackle it all. So that's why I was trying to map with that pipeline where are points where we know that healthcare, and it doesn't only apply to mental health conditions, it probably applies to physical conditions as well, where healthcare is not being good for everyone, and where genomics can make a difference. And the way of making a difference that we have here is through it's not only through the discovery of individual genes, individual genetic variants, individual common rare variants, but through the actual application of them in settings such as the one Kim is here. Something that we've members of the CNGG have said over many academic and non-academic publications is the fact that genomics is fairly useless if we cannot take our results to trials, and if we cannot take our results to actual settings where we can evaluate not how do they look in a research point of view, but how do they look in the real world. And we have several projects at the moment that I focus in that real world. I think the clinic is one of them, but also more academically oriented projects that I focused on actually putting those results into real world.
And I think, you know, it's right that people have been trying to find new treatments for schizophrenia for many years, but they've been doing that on the basis of educated guesses rather than fundamental knowledge. So they've tried from using neurotransmitter knowledge to guess which are the targets to go for. What the genetics gives you uniquely, I think, is the biological basis that otherwise it's difficult to identify. And that's proven to be the case over the last 30 years. But the reason why drug companies are now interested in mental health conditions again is largely because of the genetic findings and the way that if you've got a genetic association, your chance of taking a drug through to actually getting drugs effectively into patients is through having genetic support. So I think that's something worth stating as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not a magic wand, is it? But without understanding these very fundamental mechanisms, we're not going to make that sort of progress. There is a question about whether there are new medicines already. I mean, where are we on this journey?
So all the medications that are licensed to date act on the same receptor, the dopamine D2 receptor. There have been different versions of medications that have targeted that receptor and have targeted other receptors to a lesser or greater extent, but that's been the fundamental mechanism. There's the promise at the moment, so within the last month, there's an announcement that a drug that acts on what are called muscarinic receptors might offer promise, which is a really exciting development. Whether that itself is having an effect on dopamine, we don't know yet, because that's a new compound, but that's certainly an exciting development. And then, other than that, I think what we're hoping is that the genomics can start informing new targets. And so we're working with a company called Takeda, a pharmaceutical company, to use the genetic findings to actually identify targets for them to take forward. And that is, had gone to the stage where those targets are now being validated. So I think is promise that we're feeding that drug development pipeline. Yeah,
which is fantastic. And we have our own Medicine Discovery Institute as well, don't we, which is dealing in a similar sort of areas. We got a really, I think, an interesting question here about really risk factors. If we can identify people with high-risk genetic variants at a young age, is there a possibility to treat them in the future, perhaps, but to treat them before symptoms begin so they don't progress to a full-blown illness, which would obviously be fantastic if that was possible?
Yeah, do you want me to?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I guess the way I would look at that is, what proportion of people with a particular genetic variant would you expect to get the illness? It still wouldn't be most people with that genetic variant. So I think, given that a lot of our medications have side effects, there's a bit of a risk of just blanket treating people in the hope it's going to prevent progression. What I would say, certainly for example, for our CMV carriers, I would suggest educating people to know what the early signs are so that action could be attempted quicker. That's probably more realistic in the immediate future. Unless, of course, we end up with better treatments which have a lower side effect profile. Yeah. So I think that's probably the more realistic way of doing it.
Something, if I might add to that, is that there are people who have actually made the calculations, for example, for the proportion of people that with a family history of schizophrenia, for example, would have expected to have the disorder, and the proportion of people without a family history of schizophrenia that would be expected to have the disorder. And even as James established very clearly, that there is what we call heritability of these conditions, is the fact that of course, genetic variants run to an extent in families. But if we had perfect knowledge, if every one of us had perfect knowledge of the family history of mental health up to the 3 previous generations, 80% of new cases would not have any family history of the disorder. Wow. And that is for something as broad as family history of the disorder. So, not even a particular genetic variant or a particular CMV. So again, it's driving this point that the risk exists, but it's in the population and it's not easily mappable.
But I think, it's a pertinent question, because clinical services are trying to do this. Prevention as a paradigm is happening, but not that well within clinical services. And I think what it will turn out to be is that genetics is one of the factors that can help you better predict and potentially treat, although you've got to do that very cautiously, as Kim was saying, because there's the potential for harm in treating people who wouldn't go on to get the condition as well. So they're complex questions, but they are ones that we and others are thinking about very actively.
Well, I imagine that's where some of the interdisciplinary work comes in as well. Look, I can't believe it, but we're actually out of time. We've slightly overrun, but we started slightly late, so we are going to have to bring it to a close. We've had a huge number of questions in the chat there, so I'm afraid I'm going to hand over a load of work to James and colleagues to pick those up. I'm sure you're very happy to do that, and we'll get back in touch with everybody who's on the call with the follow-up to those questions. Massive thank you to our speakers. It was really fascinating. We had a great reaction to that. We've put some links into the chat if you are interested in finding out more, so please do follow that. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I can just tell by the reaction that you did find it very interesting. So you will get an email in the next few days with a copy of the recording and links to register for forthcoming events. The next event is on Thursday, the 12th of January, where we'll be hearing about current research into understanding the fundamental origins of cancer, which is a fascinating one. If any of you watching would like to get involved with Cardiff University, either volunteering time to help our students or helping us to fundraise for our research, please do follow the link in the chat box there. But that's it from us this time. Diolch a hwyl fawr. Thanks very much, everyone, and goodbye for now.